Welcome to the Korean podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Major-General Urs Gerber. A historian by training, Urs Gerber first joined the Swiss Ministry of Defense as an intelligence officer. From there, he moved to a role with the Armed Forces Security Cooperation between Transatlantic States. And importantly for today's podcast, though now retired, from 2012, he was in charge of the Swiss Delegation of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, the NNSC, which monitors the Korean Armistice along the Demilitarized Zone between the two countries. Now, of course, in 1950, the Korean War starts, but by 1951, an armistice agreement is already being discussed. Now, these deliberations are drawn out for a number of reasons, but of course, by 1953, at the end of the war, Korea has an armistice agreement. Not an end to the war, but an agreement to cease hostilities and conflict. And at this time, it was agreed that this armistice needed a neutral observer, an organization or group of states that could monitor the armistice to make sure that there wasn't a buildup of troops. A build-up towards a new conflict. There wasn't any specific violations of what had been agreed to. This organization was the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, the NNSC. And this was originally made up of 4 nations. Switzerland and Sweden monitoring the southern half, and Czechoslovakia and Poland monitoring the north. And though this has changed over the years, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and the change in nature of what is now the Czech Republic and Poland, the NNSC remains, though limited in its scope and staffed by Swiss and Swedish troops. And this is where Major-General Urs Gerber comes into the story. As tensions would spike, as provocations would arise, as the challenges of maintaining peace along the most militarized border in the world arose, all of these difficulties were under the scope of Urs Gerber. And the difficulties can't be downplayed, though Panmunjom, the truce village on the DMZ where the NNSC are based, can often seem, despite the tension, quite peaceful. This is also the site where in 1976 there's the axe murder incident, where North Korean soldiers, in a moment of impulse, bludgeoned to death 2 American soldiers. And of course, this is also the site where only last year there was that amazing footage of the North Korean defector running across the border, shots being fired after him into South Korea. And even when the conflict is not in Panmunjom, which it rarely is, the tension is still felt. The sinking of the SS Cheonan and the bombing of Yongpyeong Island, for example, are moments that sparked a real threat of emerging conflict on the peninsula. And there is only one place, Panmunjom, where South Korean and North Korean troops stare eye to eye, face each other off. And Urs Gerber had a unique insight into these tensions. He arrived at his post almost at the same time as Kim Jong-un was taking power. He witnessed unique moments of cooperation and moments of heightened fear, rhetoric, and provocation, such as in 2013. All in all, this is a fascinating new view onto the Korean crisis, the fears that often arise, and the hope that maybe one day a peace will be achieved, the armistice will become null and void, and the DMZ might just eventually disappear. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and we are still in our recruitment drive. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. On that, and without any further delay, this is Major-General Urs Gerber. Major-General Urs Gerber, welcome to the Korean podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So it's important here. So we're going to be talking about the armistice agreement, the role in which many troops have in patrol in this particular region, and of course the future of the DMZ itself. But I guess it's very important first to go back and to get some background on you yourself. So give us a brief overview of your history, your career, and how you found yourself to be on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, basically, I started my professional career as a student of history. I was then hired by the Swiss General Staff as a civil servant. But as you might know, in Switzerland, you can be a civil servant and still be a part of the armed forces, what we call a militia officer. So I rose in ranks and in different jobs on the civilian side in strategic intelligence for quite some time, and then changed into international relations. And before going to Korea, I have been the Deputy Director International Relations of our Ministry of Defense. During that time, I rose in ranks in the military as an infantry officer. I assumed command over different company size unit, battalion commander, and so on and so forth. and was then selected in October 2011 to become the head of the Swiss NNSC delegation, which is then linked to a promotion to Major General. So that's how I got there. Why I got to Korea? It's an interesting story, I have to say. I was dealing with the portfolio Korea in the Ministry of Defense, but from a more political point of view. So I was aware of the point, but I never really thought through on whether I would be interested in. And then I was sort of pushed into it by a very good friend of mine who is a Swiss, used to be a Swiss ambassador. And from then on, it went pretty quickly. So then I was then asked on whether I would like to go, and which I responded very positively. There we are.
Okay, yeah, that's a good little overview there. So just as one more piece of flag set in here so we can find out where we're coming from. The Korean War happens in 1950, and by 1951 they're negotiating an armistice agreement. And by the end of the war, they have this agreement in hand. And this is vitally important for how you came to be on the Korean Peninsula. So just what was the armistice agreement, and how did that affect your station in the DMZ?
Well, actually, as you know, the armistice negotiations basically started in Kaesong first, and then were pretty soon moved to this hamlet called Panmunjom, and all the negotiations then were continued in Panmunjom, and that's also the place where this agreement has been signed. Now, maybe I have to go into how Switzerland got into this equation.
Yes, please do that.
Very obvious for some reasons. I think it was in December 51, so at about 4 months after having started the process, Washington was asking Switzerland on whether we would be ready to contribute and to be a part of this so-called Neutral Nations Committee or Commission that they would intend to create. And as you would assume, for us, that was pretty much a surprise for several reasons. First of all, Switzerland was at that time not a member of the United Nations. That's a first thing. We only got membership in 2002. And secondly, it was a positive notion that the United States of America was asking Switzerland to participate in a sort of peacekeeping role on a neutral commission. I have to elaborate very quickly because why that is. As you might know, neutrality just shortly after the Second World War was very much disliked, particularly in the United States of America. So Switzerland has been sort of put in a corner that we, through our neutral standpoint and status that we would have added to the prolongation of the Second World War, that we would have at least indirectly helped Nazi Germany to keep assets safe and so on and so forth. So for us, it was a sort of first positive recognition of the term neutrality, and also a sort of first step to really start a new process in the bilateral relations with the United States. So it was sort of, you could argue, it started with a bilateral issue and then became a global issue with our participation, which was then set together with the 3 other nations that participated. And since these 65 years plus several months, we are present on the Korean Peninsula.
So I might get you just to explain those other 3 nations here, because this is quite fascinating. So on your side, there is Sweden and Switzerland, and on the northern side, there is Czechoslovakia and Poland. But this has changed from its original dimension. So I might get you to just tell us how this has shifted, because this is going to be important when we talk about your role there and your access to North Korea. So it was originally 2 versus 2, and that changed at the end of the Cold War, I understand.
Yes. that's a good introduction that you mentioned two and two. So both sides were able to nominate two nations. Actually, at the beginning, there were three nations, but the North then nominated the Soviet Union, and to get out of that sort of trap, both sides then agreed, okay, we skip one. The Soviet Union then obviously fell out. On the southern side, it was Norway who was on the ticket at that point. So those are the four. And the problem was, and that was also a really important reason why the cooperation within this Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission didn't really work. Particularly the North Koreans viewed the Poles and the Czechoslovakians as their allies. So they expected them to defend their cause within the Commission. And with the strong support from Moscow, as you might expect, there was almost no possibility to get to a consensus within the Commission, which at the end only ended at the end of the Cold War. And that was also, unfortunately, then the sort of starting point to the end of our communication and cooperation with North Korea, or the KPA, because as we all know, those two nations, Poland and then Czechoslovakia, changed ideologically the camp. And hence, out of that 2 against 2, it became a 0 against 4. And that's the reason why North Korea then sort of asked their two so-called two partners to leave. In the case of Czechoslovakia, it was pretty easy because Czechoslovakia split on 1st of January 1993. The Czech Republic wanted to come back as the sort of legal successor to Czechoslovakia, and that was then refused by North Korea. And the Poles were sort of kicked out, not physically, but sort of they were cut off of electricity, they were cut off of water. So the delegation then went first to Pyongyang, and then they left the country in 1995. But Poland is still a member of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, but since 1995, not anymore with a permanent delegation in Korea, but they come over twice a year to sort of sort out formal decisions which have more or less only a symbolic way. But still, in the setting of the Armistice Agreement and the NNSC, they provide the signature sort of from the northern side, even though they are not anymore accepted, but it's clearly stated in the agreement that decisions by the NNSC need to have at least one signature from both sides, and hence Poland is the sort of provider of this important signature. So
we've spoken a little bit about what the NNSC is here and your role there, but just what exactly does it do? So there's this understanding inside the DMZ that it's a demilitarized zone for 4 miles, 4 kilometers on either side, and there's a limited amount of military hardware in there. Now, as you mentioned, you no longer have access to North Korea per se, but in your role there as the leader of this delegation, what exactly were you charged with doing?
Okay, the Commission had the role, as the name indicates, to supervise the correct implementation of the agreement. And in the setting of this agreement, it was the two coalitions or parties to the war that were tasked to implement the armistice. And it's important to notice that, and that's one of the reasons why this specific setting has been established, the United Nations, which normally does this job of sort of supervising, of implementing, of guaranteeing, the United Nations in Korea is a party to the war. That means the United Nations is, or in Korea you call it military as United Nations Command, is an American-led coalition who got a mandate by the UN Security Council to repel the North Korean aggression. Hence, in this specific setting, they were looking for an independent and impartial body above or apart from the warring factions to supervise that body. And that's basically, fundamentally, that's the role of the NNSC. However, the mandate is by far not as robust as most of the United Nations mandates in other peacekeeping areas. So we do not have or never had troops to enforce or to implement it, but rather to advise and to give feedbacks and report to the Military Armistice Commission. And when I speak of Military Armistice Commission, this commission that consisted up until 1991 by delegations from the KPA and from the United Nations Command. And since 91 anyway, there have never been ever more meetings between the two. So it's from that moment on, all these activities were sort of one-sided, basically only on the southern side. So the mandate is defined in the agreement, which basically was in the beginning focused on one side in meetings in these famous blue barracks in the JSA, but secondly and most importantly by doing inspections in so-called 5 ports of entries on both sides, so in North Korea as well as in South Korea, and the commission, always with teams that were composed of all 4 countries, tried to do inspections in order to ensure that not more materiel and or personnel would come to the Korean Peninsula than that they would leave. So that basically that the sort of a threshold would not be surpassed in order to allow one party or 2 parties to restart military operations again. But this second part that I was just dwelling upon had to be skipped in 1956 because very strong resistance by South Korea, particularly based on their assumption, which then turned out to be correct, that our mainly the Polish and the Czechoslovakian friends of working for the NNSC were severely involved in information collection, intelligence basically, for their headquarters back home, and rather not really very much interested in supervising the Armistice Agreement. So this has been skipped, and then basically up until the early 2000s, the NNSC was sort of confined to the JSA with these more symbolic activities. But at least up until 95, we were the only ones basically to have free access on both sides of the MDL in the JSA. So the commission members from all 4 countries were allowed to freely move back and forth, whereas all the others, as you certainly know, after this tragic Axe Tree murder incidents in 1976, were not anymore allowed to pass or cross the MDL, even in the joint security area. And then the last bit, which when I was then in Korea, we got tasked from the United Nations Command to do a lot of observations within the DMZ, but also outside of the DMZ on military activities in different areas to check basically in a sort of according to the spirit, to check that these activities of the South Korean armed forces, but also the Americans, that they would be in line with the spirit of the Armistice Agreement, or to translate it into more real stuff, to check that they would not prepare for a large-scale offensive into North Korea, a thing that particularly the North Koreans were always claiming, particularly during the large exercises that are now on hold in Korea. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the activities that we were doing over the time.
So you brought up a very interesting point there. I'm glad you did. This point in 1954 to 1956, where there was some strong protests in South Korea from the Americans and from local people themselves that saw the NNSC as a hindrance here. So my next question here is, how are you now seen from both sides? I can guess how you're seen from the northern side. I've got in front of me some dates in which the North have claimed the Armistice Agreement to be void: 1994, 96, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2013 are all times that the North Koreans have decided that the Armistice Agreement is no longer valid and have announced that, which of course implies that the NNSC has to leave. But beyond that particular look, how are you seen by the troops on your side? Because you, in effect, are monitoring these American and ROK South Korean troops. So how do they see you, considering that, I suppose, in a way, you're not actually charged by the Swiss government, you're charged by the Armistice Agreement itself?
Correct. Okay. Let me go back to the North Koreans. Very rightly, you were pointing out to the declarations. Most of them have been, those were formal letters to the UN Secretary General, particularly, and most of these letters, the content was to lift. Basically, their main objective was to lift this famous UN Security Council Resolution 84. Which was the mandate to create United Nations Command. And then they link it to the Armistice Agreement. And in several cases, apart from those that you were mentioning, the NNSC was specifically also mentioned as sometimes they called us a monster organizations or a ghost organization. So we had several not incidents, but we had several times when we were directly addressed. So North Korea is out, definitely. Now, South Korea and the Americans, as we were already discussing, the start was very bumpy for the reasons you were also alluding to. Now I can only speak basically with my own experience, that time that I have been there. This very mixed feeling towards the Commission, at least with the Americans, but also increasingly with the South Korean armed forces, has been improved significantly, particularly also due to these observation activities, which particularly for the South Koreans was not always very well received, at least at the beginning, that there is an independent outside body that looks into activities of their own forces, and this is not necessarily in the DMZ. I think there they were prepared from the very beginning, but particularly the exercise observation, sometimes you felt that there were at least some reservations. But I must say, if I compare the whole 65 years, the last, let's say, up 6-7 years, that has nothing to do with me, by the way, the cooperation and the appreciation of the forces involved, meaning particularly Americans and South Korean, has significantly improved and was on a comparatively high standard.
Okay, that's a good background here for what we're going to move into now. So specifically your time in the DMZ and some of these broader security questions there. So we might flush some things out here. So as people may know, when you go to the DMZ and you go to Panmunjom, it's where South Korean and North Korean troops, they stand across from each other, almost eye to eye across this border here. And you were monitoring these particular troops, at least from one side. So what was your experience there? And did you notice any particular differences between either side? And what was your general overview of the two militaries on either side of this border that you witnessed?
I think I should start with what we have already discussed, which was really, I would say it was almost amazing. And I was very grateful that it was as it was, even though I was basically exactly in charge during the time where the tensions in sort of the overall time was most probably one of the highest over the 65 years. But still, you were mentioning, and that's correct, North Korea formally declared that they would not anymore consider the Armistice Agreement as valid. But still, and that's the good point, at least up until now, the KPA in their implementation of whatever they do in the DMZ, they still followed the rules of the Armistice Agreement. We tended to say at least up to 95% of all the regulations, the procedures, and particularly in the JSA, where you have tourists, where you have civilians, and what else. So that was extremely helpful. That basically both sides, to a pretty high standard, kept the rules and regulations alive. Now, moving to the southern side. In the southern side, I experienced when I came, there was still this, the bad feelings in the South Korean military particularly, but also in the South Korean leadership, that South Korea and their armed forces had been humiliated by the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Waipido. So there was a sort of, not officially, not on a daily basis, but there was a sort of indirect pressure on the forces to really, and they used the term, to retaliate in case that the KPA would commit provocation. And that sort of increased the tensions on the lower tactical level on top of the tensions that were more in the strategic or the political side. That was, I would say, up until early 2016, the incidents and the sort of what they call provocations got to a point where they were really well above that what should happen under normal circumstances.
So I'm glad you mentioned provocations there, because you touched on it just a little bit earlier. There's been a lot of change since then. So you mentioned there's a lot of tension in the air, if so some, but the North Koreans, by and large, behave in accordance with the Armistice Agreement. But you mentioned earlier the 1976 axe murder incident. And of course, this happened when American and ROK forces tried to cut down a large poplar tree that was obscuring part of their view. And they were attacked by North Korean soldiers. On one side, 2 Americans were killed, others were injured. And the response was a very large American response. The troops moved back in, cut the tree down, and there was not bombing raids, but mock bombing raids over top. And the tensions were through the roof. And since that time, things have changed. That was more of an open zone, I understand, where people could interact, and they can't anymore. But did you ever sense that such tensions were still possible? That in a way, an impulsive sort of event like this one could happen again at any moment?
Maybe not one-to-one, but there were times where exactly from incidents or from developments that sort of escalated to levels that were really pretty close. So if I could mention one, where
yes, please.
The situation was really very, very tense. That was the follow-ups, the sort of this landmine accident in August 2015. And I think there we got pretty close. The difference between August 15 and by the way, also August 76 was the mine accident. Okay, that came out of the blue, but we had mine accidents before as well. But then,
so I'll just interrupt for a second. Just for people listening, the landmine incident was effectively, if I'm right, South Korean troops walking across their side of the DMZ,
right.
Stumbled across a landmine. 2 were injured or 1 was killed. And the assumption was that the northern side had crept across in the night and planted it there for them. Is that correct?
Yes. So it was basically, that's correct. 2 South Korean non-commissioned officers were severely injured. Nobody was killed, but they were severely injured by explosions of landmines, which happened definitely on the South Korean the South Korean side of the DMZ. And the assumptions, and that was interesting to see, there were several conclusions and assumptions who might have been planting these mines. But the most reasonable, I would assume, but you, up until the end, you did not have the absolute final proof. The assumption was that it was most probably planted by North Koreans. That's correct, yes.
And this tension, how so much did you feel it on the ground? Was there a sense that there could be some retaliation? Because it's not unheard of for there to be the occasional crossfire across this border. So was this ever likely, or was it just unlikely in Panmunjom, but more likely in other places of the DMZ?
Well, we had basically, there were incidents where weapons had been engaged, quite particularly in the period that I was mentioning, pretty not often, but there were, most of them, luckily enough, did not take place in the JSA. So there is a little bit less attention to the area, but I would argue most of these incidents, that was not pre-planned, that was not a plan behind, but there was a sort of miscalculation by the officers, mainly on lower ranks. Most of them basically started with firing from the south on activities of the KPA on the northern side. So that was unintentional. Now, if you go to this mine accident in 2015, assuming, as we were discussing, that most probably the northern side has planted this mine. So there was a deliberate activity by one side. And then from that on, the next step, which was really then escalating the whole thing, was the resumption of the loudspeaker operations by the South Koreans. And with that, and you could almost feel that when you were sitting in Panmunjom, that the North Koreans were completely taken by surprise. First of all, not least due to the fact that they still claim up until to that day, I cannot prove that they were not involved in this operation, at least officially not involved. And this loudspeaker operation then was retaliated for sure, their own loudspeaker operations. And from that moment on, it really was a sort of tensions went up. And then during the large-scale exercise, which then started in mid-August 15, there was an exchange of artillery fire, alleged at least as far as North Korean fire was concerned, but definitely answered and sort of retaliated by a large barrage of heavy South Korean artillery fire. And there we were at the level which then really surpassed by far the tactical level. We had the air forces. There were a lot of aircraft in the air. The air patrolling was increased on both sides. Naval activities increased, and there we were pretty close to a possible confrontation. And this was not a surprise. This was sort of an escalation scenario, which then was luckily enough then cut short by this meeting in Panmunjom, which has been arranged within 3 hours. And then led to the 6-point declaration in Panmunjom between the two Koreas, with the effect that the tensions, at least for a couple of months, have then been reduced, but then got up again towards the end of 15, early 16, with the nuclear and the missile tests by the North Koreans again.
Now that brings in a question here of what the DMZ really looks like, because as we were talking through the 2015 landmine attack and this unprovable assumption that North Koreans maybe came across and planted the landmine, it makes me think about how hard it is to cross this area, because you hear again and again and again that it's the most militarized area in the world, this 4-kilometer barrier. But if people are capable of walking across it and planting bombs, you begin to get a different image in your head. And of course, other people have mentioned this before, that the DMZ in some ways today has become almost like a wildlife reserve. It's incredibly peaceful, and because human beings aren't there, you get these all these animals are coming back and flourishing inside the area. So what does the DMZ actually look like? How hard is it to cross?
Well, the real sincere answer would be, I don't know, because I haven't walked in the area, but even still, I lived 5.5 years basically in a heavily mined area. So what should I say? I think, first of all, if you theoretically, according to the letter of the Armistice Agreement, there should be roughly 1,000 square kilometers of untouched land. That's the basic 4 kilometers deep and at about 245 kilometers wide. If you add that up, that's about the 1,000 kilometers. And as you already were alluding to, it's the most demilitarized zone on that planet. So there is a lot of activity going on, and there was a survey in about 2014 by a satellite-based survey, which came to the conclusion that out of these 1,000 square kilometers of officially untouched land, only a little bit less than 2/3 of this surface is untouched. The rest has been most probably cleared of mines in certain areas by erecting watchtowers, guard towers, path for patrols. So there is, in some areas, quite a lot of activity where I would say, technically speaking, the danger of crossing this area is smaller than in others. So let's take Panmunjom, or let's take the JSA. There, most of the mines have been cleared. And I just, as you might have seen this week, they cleared some parts of the JSA, adjacent parts. But still, if you go maybe 100 meters outside the JSA, then any crossing, particularly when there are no patrol path or watchtowers or guard towers, then it's extremely dangerous. And by the way, this assumption of these North Koreans who supposedly planted the mines in 2015, it's considered to be a sort of bold action by people, sort of Russian roulette, as you would call it, to prove that they are brave to do so. So, but normally it's still considered by all sides, by all units, as extremely dangerous to walk in any of these areas.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you were there in 2013 when tensions in some ways were really, really near the top of the roof here. And at some point, the North Korea announces that they're going to scrap all non-aggression pacts and that they shut down this joint phone line, which has only recently been reopened in some ways, and made a claim, which I suppose is not out of the course for North Korea, that a preemptive nuclear attack by them was not going to be ruled out. And so that's what you lived through in 2013. But just before you arrived, as you mentioned, in 2010, there was the sinking of the SSS Cheonan, which killed a number of South Korean sailors, and the bombing of this civilian island in 2010 as well. So when these particular actions happen, how do you see them? Do you feel this on the ground? And do you think there's a chance? I mean, this is a broader question. Is there any chance that you ever saw moments like this and thought there was a chance of a broader war breaking out? Or did you always just sit back and think this is just provocation and this is just par for the course?
Well, I wasn't in Korea in 2010. I just got words from my predecessor. Apparently, as he told me, that was not a thing that had an effect, sort of that this would go further into a war. And if you read carefully the autobiography of Robert Gates, the then Secretary of Defense of the United States, there was a lot of pressure from the Americans not to have this incident being escalating into higher grounds. You mentioned 2013. That was certainly an issue that was in early March with these declarations. And for that reason, I particularly went up on a Sunday afternoon to Panmunjom from Seoul, because that was the day before all these declarations would enter into force. And hence, I thought I should be in Panmunjom in the JSA to see on whether that would have a direct impact on their force posture, on their activities, on their procedures. Because if you step back from disagreement, basically you can then say, okay, the DMZ is nil and void, so we drive up tanks into Panmunjom, or have much more forces, much more with arms that are much higher than the current ones. So that was interesting to see that nothing of that happened, apart from, that's what you mentioned as well, that they cut off the phone line, which has been only established basically in 2018. But the interesting thing is that only they even skipped then for at about 4 months. They skipped visits to these blue barracks from with tourists and guests from their side. But then they came back already in September or October of the same year, and without any discussion, without any problem, they came back to these procedures that were in place before and that are still in place, that visits to this blue building, that's the central one of the three, is basically on a first come, first serve base. So there is no regulations, but you watch the other side and then you act accordingly. And that's quite interesting, given the political, strategic, and whatever other noises that were going on. So I would say 2013, there was not a feeling that really that it would go further than just declarations. 15, there was another one in 2012 in October that was then linked to one of these balloon operations. Where the North Koreans were extremely aggressive in their wording, and where then finally, luckily enough, I have to say, the South Korean police forces were really clearing the whole area around this Imjingak area where the operation had wanted to or was seen as the place to launch these balloons. And the second incident when I really had really mixed feelings, that was August. So sort of August 20, 2015, just hours before they got together, because there was a North Korean ultimatum that up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, if South Korea would not, I don't remember exactly what the North was wanting to see, stop the loudspeaker operations. Yes, that was the issue. And there was clear that the South Koreans wouldn't do that. And there I really felt now we are pretty close to things that should not happen as they were preparing for.
So if a conflict did break out, and of course you're there, you're witnessing at least some of the tension, as you mentioned, how do you see this happening? I get the feeling from what you're saying there, as you mentioned, that both sides, when it comes down to it, are really quite rational. That they always, even if North Korea maybe provokes, and even if South Korea maybe upsets them occasionally with loudspeaker announcements and pamphlet drops and even Christmas trees and things like this, that eventually they will step back. So do you see that if anything does happen in the future, it will be the case of miscalculation, one side thinking that they're not going to push too far and the other side won't retaliate in the way that they expect or don't expect, sorry?
Well, that's the rationale that we were in and that everybody was hoping. It's basically that we were never excluding, and that was basically the sort of basic assumption of the acting or the American four-star in charge. All of them that I knew during my time, they started with the assumption we cannot prevent miscalculations from happening. That's almost impossible. But the most important thing is that we will get the situation under control in as soon as possible, so that we can prevent this miscalculation from escalating to higher levels. And I think, now 2018 might be a little bit different. I've not any more been there, but if you read the papers, the overall tensions are certainly lower. But still, the forces are there. There are people acting, young people acting, that they are afraid, and so on and so forth. But I think the most important thing is, and that worked out pretty well in all these sort of incidents, that the South Koreans, together with the Americans, got together on highest levels in order to prevent miscalculations from escalating. And I think that's one of the most important activities and procedures that are taking place. And hence, I must say, with that, the likelihood of a bigger confrontation sparking out of miscalculation is, I would say, pretty much reduced.
So I'm glad you mentioned 2018 here, because as in 2017 and through to 2018, a lot of very interesting changes have happened. Of course, 2017 was almost the year of the nuclear test and the year of the missile test. They just going again and again and again. And then 2018 comes around and it's the year of peace and a lot of talk like this. So how do you see this change happening? Of course, you lived through the era of Barack Obama and the strategic patience, and then you've seen, at least now, Donald Trump and some of his rhetoric and the claims of maximum pressure. And you saw this change from 2017 to 2018. So do you have any hopes that this is going to go in a positive direction? Or is this, as some people have thought about and opined about, that maybe this is just a cycle that North Korea will go through? They will test and test and test, and they'll seek peace, and once they're ready, they'll go back to testing.
You allowed me to have hopes. And yes, I do have hopes, because I think it would benefit all parties that which, if this process of reducing tensions gradually, I think it's important. That's my personal opinion. It's important that it goes step by step, that it's thoroughly verified, that it is consolidated by all involved parties, and I think the most important, particularly in view of North Korea and its classic traditional behavior, that each step should be verified in sort of that everybody provides his deeds to the process. So not only that this feeling, which was very widespread, particularly in South Korea, that basically the Panmunjom and Kim Dae-jung years were exploited by the North Koreans, and then as a sort of a present at the end of the process, the Cheonan has been sunken and Waipido shell. So I think that's very important, that all these steps that are now going on, that they go on, but that it's not going too much into a rush. That's one side that's on the terrain, and therefore I'm pretty optimistic, particularly having seen this week that for the first time there were sort of tripartite negotiations and discussions in Panmunjom on all these implementations of this bilateral agreement among the defense ministers to clear JSA, whatever, to disarm some of the guards and whatnot. I think it's very important that those that are responsible, legally still responsible for the DMZ, that's the United Nations Command on the southern side of the military demarcation line, that they are fully engaged and that they are part of this equation. And I think with that, next steps could be envisaged, always given that implementation of whatever, mine clearing, reducing forces, withdrawing guard towers, that there is a verification set in motion, that this withdrawal, for instance, of guard posts can also be verified on the spot in the North Korean part of the DMZ, and not only sort of in the South Korean, because that would then be one-sided and could at the end be exploited, and then disappointing a lot of people who sort of have always said, yes, they fooled us again. So I think that's, at least with regard to the DMZ, that's pretty encouraging. But as I said, it has to be in line also with the strategic level. And there, unfortunately, I have some doubts that everything that's been declared and decided and signed and whatnot is always absolutely consolidated with all relevant partners.
So what about one of the other elements that's been mentioned a few times, and it came out of this Panmunjom declaration? And as you mentioned there, sometimes it comes quite suddenly, this idea of a peace deal. Now, technically, the two Koreas, despite the Armistice Agreement, are still at war. And as you mentioned quite a few minutes earlier, if, for instance, the Armistice Agreement becomes null and void, then the war is back on. But if you replace it with a peace deal, the Armistice deal is void. The NNSC, I think, then loses its mandate and has to withdraw, and you have I suppose, an organized peace between the two sides. And that's some of the, as you mentioned, the talk recently about removing some of the artillery placements and de-landmining some of the area here. So do you think that this sort of talk is premature? And am I right in assuming that such an agreement would bring an end to the NNSC?
Well, let me start with the NNSC. I think it's pretty obvious that the NNSC, if we really follow the procedure, as long as the Armistice Agreement, as signed in 1953, is in force, or at least those that have signed it consider it to be in force, then the NNSC has the legitimacy to do things. If this agreement is followed by another agreement of higher level, that is certainly a peace agreement or a peace deal, then the mandate of the NNSC expires. Then it's gone. Now the discussion is most probably, I'm not involved, hence I guess, there is this famous end of war declaration, which is in the offing, where the North Koreans have asked for. Even President Moon now is floating the idea. This, at least if you read Jong Ma-dae carefully, that does not necessarily mean, or does not mean, very affirmative, does not mean that the armistice agreement is out of order. That means NNSC would also be legitimately doing operations under the a declaration for ending the war. Now, the question, is it premature or not? I leave that to the politicians. What I see is there are different views on what I call the goodies that you could provide to the North Koreans in order to keep them on track with the denuclearization. I think this is certainly one of the topics, but I think it might be. I would continue to discuss that within the parties, as I said, with all parties involved, because they are all directly involved. But this is certainly more difficult to get to a really thorough implementation if you compare it with these smaller steps in the Panmunjom declaration, because then it's a lot of politics. It's third parties that would also like to be at least indirectly involved, PRC, Japan, and you name it. So I think it can be certainly advanced on a parallel process. Me personally, I would not push it too far in a too early stages, because it's a bargaining chip, so to speak, which is important for North Korea, which the South could also leave a little bit of leverage. And at a certain point, you can use that goodie to be sent over. But for the time being, I think we are still in pretty early stages.
Now, one thing, as you mentioned, that crosses my mind, if this idea of a peace deal comes about, then it may have some challenges to this idea that, of course, both Koreas, North and South, claim ownership over the entire peninsula, and they give automatic citizenship to any citizen that comes up from North or South or that defects. And this might put a challenge in people's minds where South Korea would have to, in a way, not automatically accept refugees coming from the North and not give them automatic citizenship. And this takes us back to this fascinating moment almost a year ago now, where this soldier ran across the DMZ. Now, defections are quite common, and you must have been watching this with quite a lot of interest. But a defection across Panmunjom, right through the line, and with North Korean soldiers firing across the line, which I assume must be a violation of the Armistice Agreement. So what did you make of that moment almost a year ago now, when that quite publicized defection happened?
Well, yes, indeed. That was, I think, the incident and the sort of action that took place, that is normally, or it used to be in my time, I just left shortly before it happened. That was the so-called nightmare scenario of the JSA. Because as you might know, we already discussed the Axe murder incidents. Then we had in '84 this defection of this Soviet son of a diplomat with a pretty heavy exchange of fire on the southern part of the JSA. So we were always a little bit afraid of things happening in the JSN. And there you were in December of last year. That's one thing. All in all, I must say I was pretty positively not surprised, but sort of confirmed that those that were responsible, particularly on the southern side, but to a certain extent also on the northern side, that for them it's important that overarching agreements and procedures have to be considered. Now let me explain, because maybe some people would say, no, that can't be. First of all, as you might remember in this video that most people in Korea probably have seen, this guy crossed the line, and then you had at least one soldier who ran after him, and then all of a sudden got aware that he had crossed the line, and he returned. So he returned on the North Korean side. There are two things that I have to mention here. First of all, it was important for the security forces of the KPA that they shot at the defector, because it's a clear obligation. If you don't shoot, the repercussions are even worse than before. By the way, both sides have to shoot on defectors if they defect on the other side. We had incidents, or at least one severe incident, when the South Korean forces shot a South Korean who tried to flee into North Korea. So that's the basic issue. So they had to shoot. But at least at the end of this critical situation, they refrained from escalating it into the sort of South Korean territory, which was pretty positive in the sense of the overall sensitivity of the area. Secondly, very professionally from my point of view, and this apparently has been vividly discussed in the South Korean media, that the security battalion on the southern side did not respond by firing back. So basically they tried to keep the escalation level on the lowest possible level. And as I knew the commanding officer on the South Korean side very well, he was then the one who was saving this person by dragging him into safety. So I think it had a sort of negative impact that it happened, yes, but you cannot exclude it. But at least the procedure that were applied looked for an uninformed person maybe a little bit rough, but in terms of an overall handling of the situation, gave an indication that both sides in the area are well aware of the risk and the implications of an escalation, and that they behaved or handled this to a level which I must say was pretty okay.
Which leads into a question that was running through my mind as you were saying that. As you mentioned, there was no surprise there, that you had a good feeling for the nature. And that moment did strike me too, when that North Korean soldier runs across the border and catches himself and realizes I've crossed and then goes back despite the firing. So if you have this sort of feel for the North Korean soldiers, it's a question I need to ask. Even though you're not technically allowed to have interactions with them, did you ever get a feel for any of them? Did you ever get any sort of personal interaction, whether it was just nodding hello to anybody that you keep seeing day after day? Because you see these images of people going, I know it's a different situation, but on tours to North Korea, and they have these very strict minders, and they're not getting any information. But after 1 or 2 weeks, the minder begins to ask the odd question and becomes interested in each other's lives. So did you ever get some personal moments with the North Korean soldiers across the border?
Yes, I did. I was visiting North Korea during my time, not in my official function, but as a tourist, so to speak. I was part of a Swiss parliamentary delegation, a private tour, and as all official, and it was not official, but the North Koreans considered this group as sort of semi-official. And that's the reason why we had to visit Panmunjom from the northern side. And at the so-called Peace Pagoda, that's where the armistice had been signed. The commanding officer in Panmunjom of the security detail there, he gave a briefing to the group and told them that the classical North Korean story, how the war ended, with lambasting against the United States, that it was wrong to bring the UN flag to the table, but they should have brought the US flag, and so on and so forth. So there was a debate which I did not participate because they all knew who I would be. But the funny story is, at the end of his talk, he came personally to me and presented himself very friendly, and then asked me on whether the story that he was just telling, on whether that was true, whether I would share his thoughts, which brought me in a pretty difficult situation. Yes. And then as a historian, my answer was, okay, as a historian, I know that basically facts, or how you describe facts, is always a question of perception. So you have an undeniable fact, physical fact, which is being described by different sides, particularly if you're in a confrontational situation with your background and your perception. And then I left him with that. He accepted that. We had then a sort of a small talk, chat, but he insisted to have a picture with me, which I have. And as I said, he was very friendly. The guide that I had was extremely well informed on all issues on NNSC. We were discussing in length this issue that you certainly have heard, that we establish reports that we put in a pigeonhole that the North Koreans don't take. They were very open, or at least he was very open to discuss that. I told him, you are more than happy to come over, and the door is always open, and so on and so forth. So basically, it's just the blockade in terms of political setting, but in terms of persons, I never ever had the feeling that they were looking aggressively, or that you felt now we are just 1 second from a physical attack. No.
Well, that's a very interesting point here. So as we begin to round this out, I got one question, and that goes, you touched on it there, this idea of tourism. Now, you must have seen it from both sides, and it's got a very popular type of dark tourism these days, where people take these tours up to up to Panmunjom, and they stand and they stare across into North Korea. And I guess you can do it from the other side, much less people do, of course. So how do you see these tours? Are they in any way helpful to the situation? Are they a problem? Are they a hindrance? Or are they just a non-entity for people that are working and serving there?
Well, I think it has, as every coin has at least two sides. It has definitely a positive side in terms of that people, particularly those that are more interested, that they get the chance to see this bizarre situation at the last confrontation line of the Cold War. You had the same situation in Berlin, more or less 30 years back as well. In that positive thing, sometimes they push it. Not the organizers, not the military, but the visitors themselves. They push it over the limits. We had one or two incidents where very famous US comics then went to the barracks, and then they performed slapstick comics in the barracks, which was then visible on YouTube, and that was bad, because it was then to basically belittle the situation and so on and so forth. The setting was strict enough, so I think that was sort of okay. I would have been living with less tourists, certainly, because on some days it was not tourism, it was mass tourism. And then and here I come to the other side of the coin. The problem is the security battalion, for them, it's a challenge. First of all, to herd all these cats, and it's really herding cats, particularly, and it doesn't rely to one nation. So a lot of visitors, you have really to impose rules that you would normally not impose. But I think security really was asking for, and I personally had personal guests when we were at one of the barracks where the commander of the security battalion ran into my barrack and said, "Sir, we have to evacuate immediately because there are too many North Korean forces around," and so on and so forth. So you felt in certain instances that it was too much. So yes, has positive aspects, but also for the guards, and that's valid for both sides. My last point is, if I compare my hundreds of visits to the southern side in the JSA with my one visit on the northern side, my own experience, the North Koreans are in their procedures are much, how should I say, they're more relaxed. The security posture is the same, so there is no difference. But they let, for instance, tourists. We had no photo restrictions on the southern side. As you know, you are only allowed to take pictures towards the north, and not left, right, or to the back. In the blue barrack, you are allowed to sit. You're allowed to walk free into it, whereas on the southern tours, you are not allowed to sit on the chairs. And there are restrictions in moving around in the building. So there you see, that was funny to see that on that side where you expect a little bit of more relaxed procedure, it was the opposite. And on the other side, it was, at least comparatively, more relaxed.
That's too fascinating not to dig a little bit more into. Why do you think it was more relaxed on the northern side? Because as you mentioned, it runs against what most people would think would be the case. So why were the North Korean soldiers more relaxed and more comfortable in this situation, in your view, of course?
Well, I don't know on whether the soldiers as such were more relaxed. I don't think that the soldiers were more relaxed. There, I think the security detail they were both under a certain tension always when there were tourists, but the procedures in terms of letting people doing things, that was more relaxed in the north, whereas in the south it was less relaxed. If I say less relaxed, I would not say that's not a statement in terms of quality. I have to say, I was always very grateful that the security battalion kept a pretty high standards on regulations, for instance, on the clothing. So, and that was the main reason, at least what they were explaining, and I think that's true, that that tourists, particularly on the southern side, should never be an object that the North could say, that was a provocation. They were ridiculing us and whatever, because that would have come back for sure. Whereas in the North, this relaxed was okay. We don't really care on the behavior. Well, it's easier. You have maybe not more than 10% of the overall tourists in the North than compared with the South. But at least I would not attribute it to the soldiers, but rather on the procedures.
So as a final question here, and to get you a chance to look forward a little bit here and think about the future, you arrived there at a time when I suppose in many ways there was still a changeover from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. And so at a time you lived through the cementing of this new leader in power. So did you see any particular changes? Did you sense anything there? And what are your hopes that he is going to be the reformer that some people think that he is?
Well, I think I really basically started exactly when Kim Jong-un really took power. And so I was not in Korea when Kim Jong-il was in power, but I was watching the things. But I think there are at least, let's call it that way, how North Korea presents itself towards the outside world, as well as some of the procedures inside the country. There are quite significant differences. So Kim Jong-un is much better in promoting his idea, him personally, even his family, or at least his wife. So they're much more visible. I think Kim Jong-un has sort of continued the legacy of the family and of the father. I think they are still on the same track, but the procedures and the strategies may have been different. And I must say, to be very honest, a person that has never met a foreign leader during the first 5.5 years of his tenure, he really did quite well with all these summits with President Trump, with President Moon, or with President Xi Jinping. So apparently he has some talents which might be, hopefully positively, might be used to develop the situation into the positive. Having said that, we have also to take into consideration, that's my impression, towards the inside with regard to stability, with regard to repression. I think he is even more efficient, at least, than his father. Just look at the figures of the defectors which come to South Korea. It has been a quite significant decline of the figures annually since he took power. So there is this, again, two sides of the coin. But I think, and at least I hope, that we can continue on that track. But Kim Jong-un, I think, is a more challenging counterpart on the other side that his father would have been.
So on that note, we should end things, I guess. I mean, I could keep talking for hours. It's such an interesting experience to pick your brain on this, but I will let you go. It's been absolutely fascinating. So Major-General Urs Gerber, thanks for coming on the Korean Hour podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.